Chair West.
Yes.
Director Mobley.
Here.
Director Craven.
Here.
Director Borchard.
Here.
I don't see any alternates in the audience. If you're agenda review, the one item on the agenda I would.
Can't hear you.
Can you hear? That's better. The one item on the agenda I would recommend we defer item number 6 for future consideration. There are a couple of unresolved items with respect to that matter. Unless anyone has some objection, we'll defer number 6. Any objections? None. Moving on then to public comments. Okay, this is an opportunity for public comment on matters not otherwise on today's agenda. It's an opportunity to come forward and address the board if you wish. Hearing none, we will move on then to board member comments. Michael? Steve?
No, Chair.
All right, moving on then to the consent agenda. There are a couple of minute items on the consent agenda. Is there a motion to approve?
Individually or both?
Collectively.
Move to approve.
Second?
Oh, sorry.
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, moving on then to item number 3 on the agenda, the decision calendar for GSP.
Good afternoon, Chair West, members of the board. For the record, my name is Kim Loeb, Fox Canyon GMA staff. And so we have a couple big items that we've been working on that are counting down to their schedule. And we thought it would be helpful to put together a key decision calendar showing the key decisions coming to your board and what the dates are for those decisions that need to be made in order to keep to the schedule. And this is a little fancier version of the same thing you have in your packet. And on the left, lists a board meeting. And then the next 2 columns are the 2 main activities that we're involved in, the GSP development and then new allocation system development. And then the rightmost column is the milestone or action that needs to happen at that board meeting in order to keep to the schedule. And so, let's see, there's my cursor. So the blue represents on this slide the regular board meetings. The light gray, or the sort of medium green there is special meetings that have been calendared in case they're needed. And then the orange here is a special meeting that we ask your board to set at that date or around that date in order to keep the decision-making process moving. So as you can see, here we are today on September 26th. We don't have any GSP decision points for you here today, but we do have some allocation decision points to keep to the goals, the board's expressed goal of a January 1st. Implementation for a new allocation system. So we'll talk about those more in a later board item. And then these are the actions that we would request from your board in terms of direction on those items, which we'll talk about again at later board meeting today. Then the next meeting on October 24th, there'll be a number of, this mouse is a little bit crickety. In terms of GSP development, we'll come back and talk to your board about minimum thresholds for water quality. We'll touch on that in our GSP update. We'll review the initial modeling results. DUDEC will present that to you. We should have that by that time. And then for the allocation ordinances, to keep to the current schedule, we would have a first reading of those ordinances on October 24th, and then come back on the 28th or around that date, a date that your board would set a special meeting to review baseline and project modeling scenarios for GSP development, and then to have a second reading and adoption of the allocation ordinances. One thing I should point out in this calendar is we don't have calendared on here and we haven't been talking about is the allocation ordinance for, a new allocation ordinance for the Fox Canyon portion of the Arroyo Santa Rosa Basin. Right now, they're on Ordinance E and IEI, same as everybody else. And so that's something that is not in the same synchronized calendar with the other basins. So that's something to keep you in mind, and we will have to come back in the coming months to your board and work on development with that to keep that synchronized with the others. So this is the rest of the calendar through July 24th, which is the board meeting at which we'll have the final GSPs to your board for consideration of adoption. There was a typo in the calendar in the board packet. It showed the final GSPs coming June 26th, but it's really July 24th is the schedule in the DUDAC agreement. They'll come to your board on the 27th of February as drafts, and that's when your board will presumably open up a public comment period. This is a living calendar. We'll update it as need be, just to try and have a lookout of the things that will be coming. And again, these board dates in 2019, these are the traditional dates that you've chosen for regular and reserved special meetings, but your board will set those dates at the December meeting. Is that right, Keely?
Yes.
January.
January.
Okay. And so that's the end of my report on this item.
Any questions or comments from the board?
Kim, quick question. July 24 final submittal of the GSP to DWR. You also have us tentatively adopting the GSPs. Don't they need to be submitted and approved by DWR before we can adopt them?
No, and again, I've cleaned that up in this calendar. We had that on June 26th, and yeah, it's not giving me the cursor. Your board has to adopt the GSPs before they can be submitted to DWR. Fox Canyon will submit the GSPs that this board has adopted.
And what if changes come back? Do we re-adopt the completed document?
Well, for one, the way that the DWR has written the regs, they're going to have a two-tier review. The first tier will be sort of a checklist, or all the components there, do they seem to be complete? And then they have set really no time frame for their full review. And what they've articulated is that they'll look at that first checklist review, and we would certainly not expect there to be anything coming back of any significance coming from there. But the DWR would expect us to begin managing under the GSP at such time as it's adopted and then submitted. And then if they come back with any kind of deficiencies or requests for additional information, then we would develop that and provide them to them. They wouldn't ask, unless the GSP didn't meet the initial checklist review, they would not ask for a resubmittal of that. And what they've articulated is for most things, they'll probably comment and tell the GSAs to address them in the 5-year update. We have to update the GSPs a minimum 5 years. So that's the way, unless they see something of real significant concern, they will probably just tell us to address it in a 5-year update.
So technically, we wouldn't adopt at the same time as submitting. We'd adopt receiving some sort of confirmation from DWR that we've met the base requirements.
No, DWR requires us to adopt it, your board to adopt it before we can submit it.
Okay.
Any other questions from the board? Thank you, Kim. Questions from the public on this item? RJ?
Hi, Director West, members of the board. I'm E.J. Remsen with the Nature Conservancy. Just really a point of clarification at the last water market subcommittee meeting, we talked about moving some items, some fairly easy items to an October 12th meeting because we were concerned that there was going to be such a heavy calendar on the 24th that that'd be on the page before.
These are just GSP and allocation system items, not items related to other matters that might come before the board. That's why they're not on here. It looks the same than the calendar we saw at that ad hoc meeting, but it's actually structurally a little different.
Well, so is that meeting on then?
As far as I know, that special meeting is still on for those items, but, Arnie, yes, I'm told yes.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions or comments? Thank you. This is a receive and file.
So move.
Second? All in favor? Let's move on then to item number 4. Kim, that's you too.
Yes. Chair West, members of the board, for the record, Kim Loeb again, GMA staff. AV booth, if we could move to the next slides, please, item 4. So this is likely the biggest item on the agenda today, I think I can safely say, and it's discussion of development of new pumping allocation system for the Oxnard and the Pleasant Valley basins. A very brief review of where we're at. The stakeholders, through a meeting, both M&I and Ag came to an agreement that the groundwater allocation, the total groundwater allocation, should be split 60% for the municipal or agriculture and 40% for the municipal and industrial. The M&I stakeholders are going to sub-allocate their allocation, their 40%, based on the current temporary extraction allocation, or T base period of 2003 through 2012. We'll talk about the ag base period here in a little bit later. They don't have to be the same because that's how we subdivide each of the ag and the M&I pools. Your board and stakeholders have expressed the desire to move to a land-based system, but as we talked about at the last regular board meeting, that based on the information that we have, we will start with an wellhead-based allocation system for an interim period. We'll request much more in-depth reporting in terms of actually where the water's going per parcel, APN, which we don't have under the current IEI system, which just through the aggregated COM codes. We'll work on implementing the administrative and technical infrastructure, new database system, in order to implement that with the idea of transitioning after that interim period to a land-based allocation system. Boards directed that the allocation should consider the Santa Clara River deliveries, especially to the pumping trough pipeline and Pleasant Valley systems, and you've articulated a goal of an effective date of January 1st of next year. We talked a little bit about that calendar in the last item, but this is just looking at the calendar for a January 1st implementation. Today, we would need your board to give us direction on some of the key allocation components so that we could prepare an ordinance to bring to your board on the 24th for a first reading, and then on the special meeting, tentatively on the 28th or thereabouts, for a second reading and adoption of the ordinance to provide a 30-day time frame that needs to elapse between the effective date of the ordinance and the adoption. And I just put together a little calendar that shows that the red circles are the regular board meetings. The green circles are the tentative or scheduled special meetings, and then the two highlighted in yellow is October 24th, the first reading of the ordinance, and November 28th or thereabouts for the second reading and adoption for the January 1st implementation. Any questions on time frame? Okay. The next thing I will discuss is the total water accounting method. This is developed from what the OPV folks called their Dindal method. And I recognize that the chart in the staff report is very busy and kind of tough to comprehend what's going on there, so I'll walk through it, and hopefully that will provide some clarity as to how this will work. So it'll include Santa Clara River deliveries to the pumping trough and PV systems. And this is, I should point out that this method is for the total pool of ag groundwater, the 60%. It's not for the individual well. This is how we will establish the total pool of available water. So the total allocation is simply the groundwater allocation plus the projected Santa Clara River deliveries. The groundwater allocation gets adjusted every 5 years if the Santa Clara River water deliveries, the actual deliveries, are less than what was projected and groundwater extraction was greater than what was allocated, then the allocation is reduced to make up for that difference. So we stay within the allocation in the long term in the next 5 years. For the example I'm going to go through, we'll be using the following assumptions. I think these are the assumptions that have been, are similar to what the OPV folks use, and it's similar to what we've used in past discussions. And so the beginning ag groundwater allocation would be 60,000 acre feet a year, or 60% of 100,000 annual. The actual beginning allocation will be set by your board. And then the ending groundwater allocation, or sustainable yield in 20 years, is assumed to be, for this example, 36,000 acre feet at the end of 20 years. We'll get the actual sustainable yield based on the GSP groundwater modeling when we have it available. So the first line we look at here on the chart is simply the groundwater, there it is, allocation over the 20-year period, starting at 60,000 and then ending at 36,000 here. So I think that's pretty straightforward. So the first 5 years of projected Santa Clara River deliveries are based on an assumed value in this method. Thereafter, the projected deliveries are based on the running average of the actual deliveries. United estimates for the long-term future, Santa Clara River deliveries will be approximately 14,000 acre feet a year. However, due to the drought and environmental issues and whatnot, the actual delivery on average is 1,200, with none in the last few years. And my understanding is that 14,000, that's not necessarily going to be available next year or the next year. That's the long-term average. They have some things they are working on doing to accomplish that.
I'll just quickly point out that United, it was announced yesterday, United lost their bid in the court case, and they're going to have to divert more water into the river. So I think that we need to be cautious about what United's projections are in terms of what they'll be able to divert after that court ruling yesterday.
Okay, very good. We'll have to find out from them once they digest that. Well, that might affect things, but this is before yesterday. So thank you for that, Director Bennett. So the current average annual ag groundwater extractions have averaged around 65,600 acre feet per year based on 2015 through 2017 reporting, and there have been no surface water deliveries. So they've been pumping to make up what they would have been getting in surface water. So in the following example, what staff has done is use the 60,000 acre feet per year groundwater allocation in the example, and then the difference, the extra pumping that's been occurring to make up for the loss of that Santa Clara River deliveries of 5,600 to be the projected first 5 year. And there was a typo in the staff report. I got dyslexic or something, inverted the 6 and the 5. But it's simply the difference between the 65,600 actual pumping and the 60,000 allocation. And then the projected Santa Clara River deliveries are based on the historic deliveries projected forward and then normalized for the anticipated 14,000 acre feet a year. And that's what this looks like here. So again, we have the black line is our groundwater allocation we saw before. Here we have the projected actual Santa Clara River water deliveries on the pipeline systems starting out the first 5 years. That's the 5,600 projected. And you can see based on the historical, the starting point of the historical, the deliveries were actually less than that. But then as we move along, catches up and we have the running total or running average of the actual deliveries. And that's what the dotted blue line is. Any questions on that?
Yes, so you're projecting forward. The solid blue line is just guesses and future deliveries, and you're trying to show with the dotted line some sort of average.
Well, they're not
value?
actually guesses, Director Borchard. So what they are is with the OPV, what they presented, they just made some assumptions of what those deliveries would be. What we did is we took the 20-year history of actual deliveries that United provided, that they said they actually delivered, and then we projected them forward. That's how we do a lot of the groundwater modeling, too. We have to take the past historical and then project them forward. And then we just averaged it so that the average annual amount over that 20-year period equaled to 14,000. So these differences in annual amounts are based on the actual historical differences. This looks just like it did in a 20-year period of history projected forward. So that gives us kind of a reason.
The solid line is the
That's
projection.
what the solid line is, yes.
Okay.
And then the dotted line is the projected. See, we have this we only know this in arrears. We don't know what the actual is until it's come. But we have to, for this method, we have to project forward what we think the Santa Clara River deliveries are going to be. And that's what this line is. So that's the projected Santa Clara River deliveries. And it's a running average starting from the beginning. So that's what that is. Maybe it'll come clear as we move on.
Great.
So then for the total basin allocation, up here in the green line, it's simply the addition of this groundwater allocation plus the projected Santa Clara River delivery gives us the total allocation. Does that make sense?
Not less, but in addition.
In addition.
Your green line is more than your black line, so your green line represents the black line plus the blue line, correct?
Yes, the dotted green line equals the dotted black line plus the dotted blue line.
Right.
That's correct. Yes. So in the example, the actual groundwater extraction is assumed to be equal to the total allocation less the actual Santa Clara River deliveries every year on a basin-wide average. And that's what gives us this graph here. So this is the example of actual groundwater extraction, and how that's calculated for the example is it's the total allocation, which is the groundwater allocation plus the projected Santa Clara River deliveries, as we talked about, and then we look at what the total allocation is less the actual delivery is projected, and that gives us the groundwater, actual groundwater pumped for the method, for the example of how this method would work. So we'll talk about this in the next slide a little bit more, but you can see here in the beginning, because the Santa Clara River water deliveries actual didn't meet what was projected, the groundwater pumping was more than what the allocation was. And that gets adjusted on a 5-year basis in the next 5 years of groundwater allocation. What we do need to have in the ordinance, though, for this whole system to work on a total water allocation basis is a method to assure that those users who have access to that surface water will take it when it's available and not pump in any way, even though it's available. So there has to be a way either through incentive, disincentive to make sure that occurs. So you can't, we did work on the method a little bit in terms of what had been put together by OPV, because what we found was at year 6, after that first 5-year period, we had a big drop off of the groundwater allocation, caused a cliff in the allocation if the Santa Clara River water deliveries did not match up with what was projected. And so we've smoothed that out a little bit so that it does not cause quite as drastic a cliff. But you can't, it's a little tough to discern here, but there are adjustments on 5-year increments. So in year 6 here through year 10, the groundwater allocation is reduced by enough to make up for this extra pumping that actually occurred. So by the end of year 10, it's on an even keel.
This issue of when surface water is available, it must be taken instead of groundwater. And you said we have to have proper incentives. You know, as we're getting ready to launch into this, have we explored this concept of the proper incentives to make this happen? And I don't know why this is so loud, but have we? What do we think are the things that we would put in the ordinance to ensure that the surface water is going to be taken and the groundwater is going to be rested during wet periods so that we can pump more groundwater during dry periods?
Well, at this time, we don't really have anything more than just a requirement that in order to maintain that allocation, that the operator would have to take that. But we have not developed a system of incentives or disincentives, because that would have to be worked out with the United and Pleasant Valley County. But we would have a requirement in the ordinance.
And it would be clear which well operators would be the ones that would have to take the surface water?
Well, we'll talk about that in a. Let's defer that conversation till we get just a little bit farther under the base period discussion. We talk about how we would work that at the wellhead basis, because again, this right here, we're looking at the overall pool, how the total of all the wells together would maintain the pumping within the allocation for the basin as a whole.
All right.
So this last chart is the one that's in the board letter, and this might be a little bit confusing, this red line here, but what this is, unlike all the other lines on the chart, this is not an annual average. This is a total cumulative acre feet of groundwater avoided pumping that might have been pumped otherwise. So you see in the first 5 years or so, because pumping was above what was allocated, we get overall a bit in a hole. But as we move forward, Santa Clara River water deliveries are there, and the pumping is reduced to meet the total allocation, then there's a cumulative savings, and that'll balance out depending on how the actual Santa Clara River water deliveries come in reality, but it will adjust itself over time because of the running average based on the actual deliveries for the projected deliveries in the future that establish the total allocation. I don't think I said that last statement particularly eloquently, but hopefully you followed what I was, where I was going with that.
Clear as a bell.
So any questions on the total water accounting method before we move on to discuss base periods?
I just take this the next step. I'm almost certain your answer is going to be that's what we'll decide in 5 years. But if in 5 years we find out that the 14,000 is just not a realistic number from United, right, because of court rulings and all of that, then we would have to adjust our ending number also, our 20-year down the road number, because we wouldn't be adding 14,000 to 36,000, correct? And when we did that, and I assume that would be at a 5-year mark down the road, then what that would do is just change the steepness of the slope for the cutbacks. Am I saying that? Is that how you see it?
No, not exactly, Director Bennett. I think that it's actually self-adjusting because we used the 14,000 in order to project, for this example, what the actual deliveries might be. But we have a fixed groundwater allocation. It says we got to be at 36,000 or whatever the number is that comes from the GSP modeling at the end of 20 years. And the total allocation is just the groundwater allocation plus the projected Santa Clara River deliveries. So in this, the projected deliveries is just the running total. If we don't get this much water, that running total will be down lower.
And when that running total is down lower, the green line
drops down
is going to
correspondingly.
drop down. It'll be steeper. That's what I'm trying to say.
Exactly. But the method's self-correcting for that.
So if you go to the 20-year mark, you have the green line right at about 50,000, right? You have it at 50,000, all the way to the far side there. Right?
Yes.
That point is going to be lower if Santa Clara River water doesn't come in, and so we'll have a steeper slope from whenever we make the adjustment.
For the total allocation. That's exactly right. You'll see where it adjusts. We have a slope that's the same as what the groundwater reduction slope is for the basin as a whole. And then because of the water deliveries, we actually get a flattening of the reduction. And then as the water deliveries decrease, it catches up and we reduce again. If we don't get 14,000 acre feet on average, and this isn't reflective of what we get, then the slope could be different. Could be, if the average is 5,600, as we start with the beginning as in this example, then the slopes will be parallel. The two curves will be parallel. If it's less than 5,600, I mean, certainly we all hope that that's not the case in the long term. Then the slope will be less.
Great.
That's
fine, yeah. And what this does is give us an incentive to make sure that we have some, it's either, if we have Santa Clara River water, we don't have as much incentive for new water, although we'll still have incentive for new water to avoid this slope. But if we don't have Santa Clara River water, it would incentivize us even more to come up with new water and our groundwater sustainability fee, our pumping fee. We'd really want to focus that on trying to locate new water. Great. Thank you.
Any other questions from the board before we move on with this item?
quick one. And kind of reading and trying to work through the numbers here. Packet, we're told that beginning ground oil allocation be at 60,000 acre feet with a ramp down to 36,000 in 20 years, which looks like a 40% reduction. I thought we were looking more at like a 30% reduction. When I've heard United talk about things with relation to their model, maybe things have changed.
This is not inconsistent with some of past discussions. It's consistent with what the OPV group used in their projections of this method. Again, what the actual number is will be, it's in the ballpark.
So
what the actual number will be based on the actual modeling for the GSP, which we should have end of this year, beginning of next.
Okay, so this is kind of ballpark thinking and based on the presentations from OPV folks, a worst case scenario.
Worst case scenario?
Again, I've heard in a lot of meetings 30% reductions, 35% reductions. Now we're looking at a 40% reduction. That was a surprise to me.
Could the 30% reduction have been with the inclusion of extra, with new water, surface water, et cetera? Because you're only dropping to 50,000 if it's surface water. I don't know.
Good point. I don't know.
3%.
And I think it's fair to remember as well, this is just an illustration for purposes of this projection.
Okay.
It's not based on any modeling that's yet to come, correct?
That is correct. And United did do a modeling that they took on the road that they called GSP Light, which they said right up front was based on historical. They weren't projecting future climatic conditions. The other thing they did was presumed reorganization of pumping across the basin without any implementation of infrastructure and piping to move that water around. It was a hypothetical operation. They wanted to see what it could be, and they also wanted to run their model through the paces to see how it reacted. So that could be partially what you're thinking about is that GSP Light hypothetical model. But we will know. We'll have the results of the modeling here by the end of the year, early next year for the GSP modeling, and that will tell us what the actual number is going to be based on your board direction and accepting that modeling result. Anything else on this total water accounting method before we move on to base period? So a base period needs to be selected to start the initial or starting allocation at each well. It's challenging, and one of the reasons we have so much disagreement amongst stakeholders over base periods is largely because conjunctive use operators, they have lower extractions when the Santa Clara River water is available to them. They take that, and they have higher extractions to make up for the loss of that. The total water use is pretty even. As we've talked about in the past, a longer base period tends to average out some annual anomalies, but too long a base period causes some implementation difficulties because there are replacement wells, new wells come online, old wells go offline, and the longer we go out, the more there is that kind of tying up the old wells to the new wells in order to put the allocation together and make it whole throughout the base period. Either wells were discontinuous, they were destroyed, or new wells came on during the base period, or they exist now and didn't in the base period, or vice versa. So there is some accounting that has to be done, and that gets more difficult, and not surprisingly, the longer you go, the more of that kind of change there can be. In order to establish the individual well allocation, we take the average annual extraction at each well during whatever base period selected, divided by the total annual extraction, and we're just talking about ag at this point, by the base period to provide the individual well extraction percent. So each well will say, during that base period, well A extracted X percent of the total extraction. And that gives us a percent allocation to attach to a well. Then that, whatever the new starting allocation is that your board should select, we talked about 60,000 in the example, for instance, we would just multiply the percent of that well's extraction in the base period by the whatever the starting allocation is for the total groundwater pool, and that gives us the groundwater allocation at that well. That's straightforward for the groundwater allocation. The challenge is on the well basis to determine a total water allocation. And some of the challenges are that prior to the latter part of 2014, Ordinance E, we don't have records of those deliveries. And since Ordinance E has been enacted, there haven't been any deliveries. So, so we do have reporting of pipeline deliveries, but it's been pumped by either Pleasant Valley or United and put in the pipelines. And we have the problems of getting it to the actual well or parcel that we talked about with the COMCODE issues. So we will have to rely on United and Pleasant Valley to help us to sort that out. And moving forward, we've talked about this, I think in some committee meetings, maybe not here directly, but in the total water method, we'll have to treat the turnouts at United and Pleasant Valley the same as we do wells, and they'd be included in COMCODE reporting in terms of the delivery. And so, and moving forward, as we talked about, we'll require much more granular reporting so that we can track on a parcel basis where the water's going so that we can then move to a land-based system once we have the information and infrastructure. So with that sort of introduction, let's move to the base periods. Now your board in recent meetings has been really looking at a couple of base periods. Staff had recommended an extended T period of 2003 to 2016 at the January meeting. We talked about that for a couple meetings. At the last few meetings, your board has been discussing the 5-year pre-SGMA 2010 to 2014 period. And so we've been looking at that. And there's also been some discussion of a 10-year pre-SGMA. And so you've seen this table before. What that shows is on a basin-wide basis, the total pumping, the total water use across any of these base periods is pretty consistent. The difference is whether there's how much Santa Clara River water extraction there is and how much pumping there is. The precipitation matters some too. Your board had asked it at one point to show the difference in each of those periods between the ag and M&I, but staff is not suggesting that you need to consider that for the sub-allocation of the ag portion of the 60% of the available groundwater. And so then this chart is simply the same data visually printed. You've seen these before, with the green being the groundwater extraction. The light blue is Pleasant Valley deliveries, and the dark blue is pumping trough pipeline deliveries, and then the yellow bar is the average annual precipitation over that base period based on the scale on the right. And then this chart, which I think we've shown before, simply shows all those base periods inclusive, and it shows the same information on an annual basis, but the precipitation is shown as a blue line rather than those bars. each year. So you can see this runs from 2003 to 2016, and so you can see in the later years, almost all the water use is pumping because there weren't the Santa Clara River water deliveries. And here you can see the actual pumping deliveries to each system and precipitation across the two basins in each of the years.
Before you move on, so if you take the 5-year period, 2010 to 2014, you'd be taking 2010, 2011, 12, 13, 14. So you'd essentially be getting 3 years of close to normal, a little bit less than normal sort of rainfall PV diversions, and you'd be taking 2 years where you had much less than normal or none at all in terms of PV and PTP diversions, right?
I think that's correct, Director Bennett.
Just make sure I'm counting two. So the years would be 2010, 11, 12, 13, and 14.
That's correct. So that's correct in terms of the Santa Clara River water deliveries. I think that an annual basis here, average, the actual precipitation is a little bit lower.
Precipitation
lower
is
than normal.
only high in 1 year there, isn't it?
But in terms of the diversions from deliveries from Santa Clara River and the groundwater pumping, you are correct.
And there's nothing that says we couldn't go 7 years, for example, instead of 5. We don't have to go either 5 or 10. We could go 7 if we chose to.
I'm not aware of anything that says you can't
That we could
pick the number that you desire to pick.
Just looking at trying to balance out, get some of the wet and some of that, but and split the baby there. But great, thank you. Just want to make sure I understood that.
So that's the end of my presentation on base periods to lay that out. And we'll move on to the ramp down to sustainable yield. So the starting allocations, which are set based on the base period, need to be ramped down to the sustainable yield over the 20 years, whatever that is based on the modeling, 36,000 or 40,000, we'll know. And several different ramp down methodologies have been presented to your board, from just a straight proportional ramp down where everybody is reduced at the same rate every year over 20 years to get to the sustainable yield, to a flat rate at the end where everybody ends up with the same amount of allocation per acre foot of irrigated land. And then the hybrid method, which the OPV folks that split the difference between those two. And then most recently your board directed that consideration of a proportional ramp down with a minimum allocation floor because of the concern of maybe stranding properties with too little water, and also did not want to punish existing low water users that may be at the bottom of where the amount that they can reduce. One thing that your board needs to keep in mind is that the floor can't be more than the sustainable yield of the basin per acre of irrigated agriculture, or else we won't get to sustainability. And using the assumptions that we talked about before, at the end of 20 years of 36,000 acre feet of groundwater allocation plus 14,000 acre feet of Santa Clara River water deliveries on average basis, gives us an ending sustainable yield, or not a total allocation, of 50,000 acre feet for total water use. The total irrigated acres in the Oxnard and Pleasant Valley basins based on IAI reporting is about 32,800 acres. That works out to about 1.52 acre foot per acre. So if that is where the sustainable yield ends up in the projected deliveries, the floor can't be more than that, because that will be where everybody's at. So if your board chose as a floor that sustainable yield, then that would essentially result in a flat allocation across the basin for everybody. So if your board is looking to have a proportional ramp down to a floor, staff recommends that that floor be lower, perhaps at 1.25 acre feet per acre or something else. But it's important to point out that your board has talked about implementing the ramp down a year after the new allocation system's implemented. So this is a decision that how to implement the ramp down. Staff does not believe needs to be landed at this time in order to move forward with the new allocation system. Your board can work on that after the new allocation, starting allocation, and after the beginning of the year, especially after we have the draft GSPs, we'll have a much better idea of what the actual sustainable yield of the basin will be.
Could I ask a question?
Yes.
You're identifying 1.2 acre feet per acre, but we're doing our allocations based on wellheads, not on acreage. So how would we do that? We'd have to have people, if we said, hey, we don't want your allocation to go below a certain amount, we'd have to associate a certain amount of acreage with that wellhead, is it?
That's correct. So as we talked about, the plan is to have an interim system that starts on a wellhead basis. We'll require that operators report what irrigated acreage the water's applied to and where that is, and we'll transition to a land-based system after that interim period. This will mostly play out towards the latter part of the 20 years. For those pumpers who are already at whatever floor you have established, they will be reporting that irrigated acres, how many acre feet per acre they're applying from the beginning. Well, even though they're reporting by wellhead, we'll ask them to report that just as we do now.
But I think, Steve, I think you hit on one of the issues why it may not be even wise to decide on the ramp down methodology now, since the ramp down does relate to acreage as opposed to wellheads, and we'll talk a little bit later about a methodology to get from where we are to where we want to be in terms of a land-based system, and we may be presumptuous, maybe be too early to make a decision with respect to a ramp down before we've got the system in place that could implement it.
I appreciate that. Might make sense. It also, in my head, it might make sense for us to indicate what our intention is. What staff's come up with, I think, a sound recommendation here. You go down much below 1.25, you have a problem. But they also address the issue. What about the people that are already below 1.25? I think it's sound to say they don't get to just automatically come up. They've got to go through a variance to prove they're going to be putting the water to beneficial use, before they were going to come up. So that strikes me as a reasonable thing. And the only reason I would say that is if we just identified that lets everybody have a sense of what we're thinking about, even though we haven't committed. Sure. Say, this is where we are. You got something better than that, come up with it. But if you don't, it's a starting point for the conversation.
Can I ask a question?
So, help me understand something. So we're going to start with, we're going to determine a base period, and that'll have a total allocation figure. But in the staff report, you're going to recommend a different figure as a starting allocation figure. That's correct? Where are we starting the ramp down? Are we starting at the base period, the total allocation, or are we starting at an arbitrary number that is down?
It's in our report. It's 60,000 plus 6,500 water deliveries. I'm just, because a couple slides ago, you took the total allocation and then you took a percentage of that to get down, used the 60,000. So you took the total allocation for the base period and then you took a percentage of it to get down to a starting allocation base. So why don't we just start with the total allocation in that base period and then start ramping down from there? versus cutting people arbitrarily?
Well, Director Mobley, I think you're talking about discussion we had with the total water accounting method. And so the total allocation for the basins as a whole at each well will be a percent of that decided. And what the
Right.
percent is based on the base period. But starting at the total allocation is based on the groundwater allocation plus to start with for the first 5 years, the projected Santa Clara River water deliveries. And so the starting allocation will be directed by your board. So just 60,000 is a number that's been commonly used in an example and discussion. And so what we said was the 60,000 is the groundwater starting allocation in that example. And the additional 5,600 of pumping represents additional pumping to make up for the surface water that's not being received, and we would project that forward as the beginning, the first 5 years of projected Santa Clara River water deliveries. We think we need to be conservative on that, because if we overproject that, then it doesn't come, then we're going to be in a bigger hole in groundwater waste. But again, those were examples used to show how the method would work. What those numbers actually are going to be decisions by your board in terms of where we start.
So I understand, taking the base period, the total allocation, but then because you actually have the amount of groundwater extractions, we know that's a known figure, but what we're projecting are the Santa Clara River deliveries. So that's a projected number, but if you, instead of arbitrarily just saying 60,000 acre feet, why don't we just take the actual extraction numbers and then the projected river deliveries and start from that point? So that's what I'm a little bit confused about.
Well, I think the problem there is that we haven't had any Santa Clara River water deliveries. So pumping has been making up for that. If we had typical deliveries, our pumping would be much lower than that. That's what we saw in those annual graphs that we were looking for at here. So we're up here, and so we're having groundwater extraction to make up for the missing Santa Clara River. So if we were getting typical deliveries, our groundwater pumping would be down here perhaps.
Yeah, a lot lower, sure.
So
So you're trying to just get closer to the average, the normal.
right, and if we chose, for instance, we said this is groundwater pumping, and then we stuck some projected Santa Clara River water deliveries on top of that, and the deliveries don't come, and the pumping makes that up, we're starting ourselves out in a hole with more pumping than has been pumped in the last 3 years, because now we've raised the allocation. So staff is proposing that the total allocation start no greater, which with both the projected Santa Clara River deliveries and the groundwater start no greater than what the actual pumping has been in the last few years.
Okay, I understand. I just wanted to, figure out your thinking and how you determine that. So
That's how I got there.
okay.
So any other questions on the ramp down at this point? All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about is flexibility. Your board's talked about the idea that you'd like to see consideration of a carry forward or accrual flexibility method. That's basically, groundwater not pumped can be carried forward to the next year with some limitations. We said no borrowing of future allocations should be included. And so some limitations that staff recommends that your board could consider is a cap of 50% on annual allocation be carried forward in any year, a total cap of 100% of allocation of an annual allocation be carried forward to the next year, and that would decrease each year as the allocation decreases over the 20-year period. And then also, staff, as well as the attorneys, have recommended that an accrued balance not be carried forward indefinitely, or else we could get ourselves into the same kind of situation we have gotten into with credits in the past, and that they expire over a period of time. Yeah, you can accrue them, but you need to, they don't get to last forever, and staff recommends that your board consider a 5-year period as a reasonable period. I'm sure there'll probably be some comments on these for your board to consider as well. But this, we thought, was a good starting point for the discussion. And so that brings us to the end of my presentation. And there are 6 things really that we're asking of your board today. Receive and file this report. Number 6 plays into the others, and that is, confirm your board's intention to move forward on January 1st, and we have a lot of work to do. And if that's the case, then we need the direction. Number 2 on the total water accounting method. We need selection of a base period for starting the ag allocation. Provide direction to us regarding the ramp down. Again, we talked about that does not need to be landed for that January 1st date. And then provide direction regarding flexibility.
Any other questions or comments from the board before we open to the public?
Just one comment. We directed staff to go out and do a fair amount of work, and all of these issues have a fair amount of complication to them. And I just want to say this is pretty clear, understandable, common sense. It feels like a good faith, not overly driven by anybody's agenda or anything, effort. I'm not saying it's perfect or that we would possibly change on the recommendations, but I do appreciate that some difficult topics are addressed here and addressed it with some clarity and common sense. So thank you.
Thank you, Director Ben. I appreciate that.
Kim, a question with respect to the total water accounting method. Are you looking for the board today to adopt those thresholds of what the groundwater starting pumping allocation will be for the year, as well as the designated number of surface water deliveries? Or is that a separate decision at a separate time?
Well, if your board's ready to make those decisions, I think that would be helpful. I think that, and I'll look to council here, I do think that, in terms of direction, are we going to move forward with that method? We need to write that into an ordinance, whether that detail of the starting number, whether that has to be landed before the first reading of the ordinance, or whether that could be accomplished at that first time. I will look to council to see for direction on that.
I think those numbers could go in the ordinance that would be approved or not approved. I don't know that we need them today.
But we do need to handle items 2 and 3 today. We have to provide direction on total water and select a base period.
Oh, yes.
Correct.
I'm curious about whether the numbers for the accounting needed to be in the ordinance, or whether the ordinance could specify the methodology without the numbers, because those numbers are going to change on an annual basis anyway. So,
and my understanding, council can correct me, is we can have numbers in the first reading of the ordinance, and based on your direction, those could be modified for the final ordinance when it comes to for adoption. Is that?
To be honest, I'm not sure. Whether or not, we even need exact numbers in the ordinance, I didn't mean to suggest that we have to have exact numbers. But I'm just saying I don't think, given the board letter and the agenda description, I think if we picked starting points today for surface water deliveries, what we're anticipating, and groundwater, that's not something that was really flagged for stakeholders. So I guess I'm just leery of doing that, but I don't want to say what's going in the ordinance or talk about it really.
Right. And it wasn't staff's intent to say that your board would make those decisions today if they were not ready to. But the method itself, a base period to move forward, and then a direction on flexibility so that we can build that into the ordinance is what we need direction from today to stick to the January 1st implementation date.
Thank you. I think I understand. All right. There are no other questions from the board. Are there questions or comments from the public?
Afternoon, Chair West, members of the board, Jared Bouchard, General Manager with Pleasant Valley County Water District. I wanted to ensure that the board did receive a copy of our letter from our council and it's entered into the record for this item. In addition, I would like to, again, I think, Director Bennett, your comments, I think staff made an honest effort at bringing it as they understand it, as they understood the issues. I think there's a couple of key clarifications that I hope your board really considers as you move forward with the total water accounting method versus what has been proposed by the agricultural community as an all-water proposal. The total water accounting method only recognizes Santa Clara River water. It doesn't recognize the other conjunctive use projects that this board has been supportive of, adopted ordinances to support, and that we've all operated under, such as the Canyon Creek water, the recycled water deliveries from the city of Oxnard. Those are important components to any total water accounting methodology. For example, if staff's conclusion that based on 2015 to 2017 base periods led them to a conclusion that the correct amount was pumping plus Santa Clara River water of ag deliveries of 65,000 acre feet of water would be, or somewhere in that range, would be correct. There's almost an additional 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 acre feet of water, depending on the base period, that sits out there as in lieu deliveries from these conjunctive use projects that we're not accounting for or recognizing in that. And those are important components that we make sure that those recycled water programs and Canyon Creek deliveries continue to move forward. So we would ask that part of your direction to staff is that we figure out how to include those and work with those of us that are part of those conjunctive use projects to ensure that those get included. And again, the difference between total water accounting and an all water program is really what that's based on and what has been proposed to your board by the OPV group. The other, I guess, key component to this, and that maybe in helping you understand what was referred to as the DINDLE, or diversions normally delivered in lieu. That was a term that the OPV group coined, and what we were accounting for there was not necessarily the water that came down the pipelines, although that was an easy way to do it historically. More recently, because of complications with issues on the Freeman diversion, whether it be quagga mussel or other things, we weren't able to take delivery of that water for operational reasons. However, the number that's proposed up there was only 1,200 acre feet of water or whatever it was delivered in the last couple of years doesn't recognize what we were trying to get to, which is accounting for ag's portion of the actual diversions off the river into the basin. So the easiest way that is said is that although maybe only 1,200 acre feet of diverted water came down a pipeline in those years, a lot more water than that was actually diverted and placed in the spreading basins, which benefited the entire basin. And that was the component we were trying to get to, was an accounting methodology that accounted for the diversions and a percentage share of that being applied to the agricultural pool. And I think whether we missed that in the conversation, and if we're only accounting for actual deliveries down the pipeline, those may not come back till there's issues related to the quagga mussel that are resolved or other operational issues. Those actual pipeline deliveries may not come back. That will significantly affect that curve that staff did a good job of describing the difference in how surface water would affect the total overall agriculture pool and how we would account for it. So I think those are key components that deserve some more exploration and understanding prior to taking the jump ahead. And I just ask that if you guys need some more clarification, I think we have technical experts here. I would do my best, but I think that others might do a better job at describing that to you. So I'd ask that you consider those items before making a decision.
I have two questions for you. One, do you have methodology for how to factor in Caneo Creek water and recycled water?
Yes.
Okay, and so that's something, have you shared that with our staff?
Yes.
All right. And then my second question is, when you were talking about diversions
Correct.
and wanting to account for diversions rather than water coming through the pipeline, diversions were taking place while the pipeline line was flowing in the past, weren't they?
Yes.
So would we be potentially double counting diversions if that's the case?
No, Director Bennett. We when we did the accounting for it, we took actual pipeline deliveries, I guess, and that's what we used in the historical accounting to get there, and obviously United's projections of what those deliveries were. What we said was, because of operational complications, we wanted to account for the diversions, because really it's the same water, right? Whether it gets diverted and sent down a pipeline or gets diverted and gets put in the basin, it becomes the same water. It's just more efficient to deliver it down the pipeline to areas like Pleasant Valley.
So you're not saying all diversions, just the water that would have gone in the pipeline, if that water is diverted, that's the water you want to take.
Right. If we took the historical diversions of the Santa Clara River and what was historically delivered through the pipelines, it's roughly 22% annually. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we said, and that happens to meet the United the match up perfectly with United's projections of 14,000 over the long term with the pipeline. So it works out, the numbers work, it's fair, it's equitable, and we also did, just for reference, present that to the M&I community, and they were supportive.
Thanks.
Thank you.
John Matthews, I'm General Counsel for Pleasant Valley. I hate to do this because I'm probably going to confuse you, but I want to respond to Supervisor Bennett's question, because I think it's a good one. And what Jared was trying to say, over the years, we've taken a lot of water from United, and we've worked cooperatively with United to try and make years where there was excess water where we take it, and there's years like recently where there hasn't been water. And we recognize that the forebay is stressed right now. So when you see the numbers of what United can divert, we have a contract with them that says that we'll get 12.22% of that diversion. But because the forebay has been stressed, we've worked with United and say, for the most part, put that in the forebay for the time being. That's been exacerbated by the fact that we've had some quagga mussel issues, and we're concerned about taking surface water that may get into our system that has quagga. So I think the point that Jared's making is that the diverted water is water that benefits everyone, whether it's put in the forebay or whether it's delivered by pipeline. It's certainly more efficient for us to take it by the pipeline, to take that. But there's going to be years, and I think Director Mobley will, I hope, sustain this, that, we're going to let the water that gets diverted at the Freeman diversion get first put into the forebay. We're not going to start pounding our fists and saying, you owe us 12.22% of that diverted water, no matter what happens. We're just not going to do it unless things get worse than they are now. The other thing that I was a little confused, and it's not hard for me to get confused, is that when Mr. Loeb was up talking about the base periods, the first base period was the T-base period, which went to 16. And I thought, I don't agree with the board on this, but I thought the board had taken the position that you weren't going to consider anything after sigma. For allocation purposes, we think you can legally. You could go up to today and consider that in an allocation. But it seemed a little odd to me that with the position that you'd taken that you weren't going to consider any of that you were going to look at up to 2016. The other thing that I can't get my head around quite yet is some of Kim's charts where we start with the 5,000 and then we kind of creep up over some period of time. It seems to me that almost ought to be flipped the other way around. We ought to assume that we're going to get what we've gotten in the past, which is more than the last 5 years, because it's been a very dry period. And, for example, PV in some years has taken, upwards of 20,000 acre feet. And that could happen again next year if we get the 4-bay full. So I don't know why we start that. To me, that seems that really cramps down the ag allocation from the beginning. And we keep saying, well, we'll adjust it in 5 years. In 5 years, it may be too late to adjust anything when we're talking about these kind of numbers up here. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Bob Seamack with United Water. I just wanted to comment on a comment that Supervisor Bennett made about the lawsuit or the ruling. Judge Carter did issue a ruling early this week. It was a 150-page ruling. And our legal, technical, and executive team is analyzing that ruling right now. And I personally have not been involved in any of it, so I'm making statements on a very high level. So when asked the question who won and who lost, it's really not, we cannot characterize the ruling as a total loss for United Water. At the same time, we can't characterize the ruling as a total win for the plaintiffs. The other moving part in this ruling is that we did file or submit a habitat conservation plan for review and approval, which has many of the elements that are in the ruling, which we were going to pursue anyway if approved by the regulators. So I just wanted to make that statement, and it's really a work in progress, and it would be premature to say who won the game and who lost the game. We're still in the game. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Jurgen Gramco, Southland Sod Farm. I want to check off some comments on the items as they were presented. On the total water accounting method, in the packet, the last paragraph of the last statement said, if actual groundwater extractions are less than the total allocation, then the savings accrues to the basin's benefit. What I'd like to see there add to that, and flattens the slope to sustainable yield, because it can accrue to the basin's benefit in two ways. One, it can shorten the pathway to sustainable yield, or it can flatten the slope. So I just want to make sure that we're still talking about 20 years and flattening the slope. Then on the base period, of the choices, there is really only one choice in my mind that makes sense both logically and from a legal framework, and that's the 10-year pre-sigma. And the reason is that it's the only one that coincides with the 60-40 ratio. And, you know, staff has often said that we have the freedom to sub-allocate the 60% however we want. Legally, I don't think that's how it would play out. A 60-40 ratio would be derived from a prescriptive period, and it would be a common prescriptive period. So that is the same as having a common base period here. So if we're going to pick something other than a base period that coincides with the 60-40, then I think you should also change the ratio with the cities to that a ratio that coincides with the different base periods. So I believe if you were to go 5-year pre-sigma, then the ratio would be 37-63. And if you went TEA, extended TEA, it'd be 61-39. I think it's important to keep in mind that the right that the cities have to water is derived from an assumption that they would prevail in prescription. And prescription is based on is based on a base period. The agricultural community would use the same base period. to prove its self-help, and that's how the ratio would be derived. So I think you have to have a base period that's consistent with the 60-40. Also, as John mentioned, the base periods that have periods that are post-sigma are not going to be recognized as in a court as having any validity, because the follow-up legislation to sigma said for the purposes of prescription, anything after January 1, 2015 until the point of the adoption of a GSA doesn't count. So I really think you need to sort of armor whatever you're doing so that it holds up to adjudication as best it can. The other part that needs to be pointed out is, to the extent you're making a choice between the 5-year pre-sigma and the 10-year pre-sigma, recognize that both of them have the year 2014 in them, which was the first IAI year. And IAI had disproportionate effects on individual growers. And my sense is that IAI pinched about 20 or 30% of the growers and didn't affect others. So that's in this history now. And if you have a long period, you can kind of average out that anomaly. If you have a short period, now that anomaly impacts that particular grower's allocation more. And I just don't think from a fairness standpoint that's right. And then I think in Kim's presentation, he also talked about a longer period simply averages out anomalies better, which is kind of a fundamental of statistics. And so I think all paths in my mind lead to the 10-year pre-sigma base period. On the minimum allocation of 1.25 acre feet, I think that's fair. I mean, that's just one of these things. Does it feel right? It shares the burden, but it creates a safe harbor for the very low users. And as a matter of fairness, I think that's good. If it went to adjudication, I think it would be a proportional ramp down and there wouldn't be a safe harbor. But I don't think we have to be that harsh. And on the flexibility part, I really have some issues with the idea that you can't carry everything you save forward, and that whatever you have that's older than 5 years, you lose. Just real simply, if a typical drought wet cycle, look at the rain maps there. It's more than 5 years. Typical hydrological cycle is probably 10 years. So if I can't hold my accruals that I gained in the wet years to carry me over into the dry years because they expire before we get to the dry period, then it doesn't help me manage the water. I end up losing my credits at a time when I really need them. And I think the credits, we'll call them accruals now, the credits just have a bad rap because there were loopholes in the previous system that allowed the generation of credits through the fact that surface water wasn't part of the overall accounting. Surface water is going to be part of the overall accounting. The allocations are going to be tight. I don't know how credits are going to materialize out of some loophole. I think credits are going to be very difficult to earn, and once you have them, I think you ought to be able to keep them and use them strategically as you need them. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments? Curtis? Marty?
Martin Gramco, Southland Sod Farms. I'll be pretty brief, and I'll address the flexibility issue. There is also this idea that we shouldn't borrow, that borrowing is off the table. And I think I've presented to the board last time or the time before, and I talked about the idea that you get to the end of the year, and that's when you really know whether you're going to make your water budget or not. And I'm not here to, I'm not going to argue with you or try to change your mind regarding borrowing, but I want to offer up a different solution, which would be rather than pay your penalty, you allow a grower to fallow a certain amount of acreage. So if you get to the end of the year and you've done your accounting and you're over by, 10 acre feet, 100 acre feet, whatever the scale of your operation is, that you then are allowed to fallow the following year. You have to prove it up and show that those acres were not farmed. And rather than paying the $2,000 penalty or whatever the penalty may be, that you then go fallow the ground. The idea there being is that that fallowed ground will in fact save the water versus the penalty essentially just generating a fee. Thanks.
Thank you.
Excuse me, Chairman West, members of the board. Curtis Hopkins representing the M&I group from a technical standpoint, and to just discuss the 60-40 split, how that was determined. There were a lot of factors involved, and it has been an ongoing discussion for a couple of years. So 2 years ago when we started it, that was a good number to use for several reasons, including, excuse me, the amount of acreage that was being converted from ag to M&I, and that over time, water history didn't have a chance to reflect that. So the 2003-2012 T period was believed a representative period, even though during that period, M&I went through the historical cutback to 75%. It had 3 years of wet, 3 years of dry, 4 years of average. And over that period, the groundwater allocation balance was in the range of 57-43 or 58-42 ag to M&I. 60-40 was believed a compromise from the M&I standpoint. But I have to recognize, again, that was pumping under a cutback system. They were also planning on using allocation that was conserved during the drought. But in 2014, the emergency ordinance E prevented that from occurring. And in 2014, M&I was cut back to 90% of T, so further cut back below historical. So anything after that you use as an allocation period, M&I is demonstrating pumping that is further restricted. And so from their position, the further back 2003 to 2012 is a representative period.
Good afternoon. I've not spoken to you before. My name is Gary Arnold. I've been a partner of John Matthews for 40 plus years. I'm also one of the directors and officers of the OPV group. I am a landowner. My brother and I own 160 acres of Oxnard Plain. I'm the son of two farmers. My father and my grandfather have been here for many, many decades. So I live and breathe a lot of this to my heart. I am surprised in the presentation that stakeholder input has been seemingly ignored. OPV has been meeting for 3 years, has spent close to $500,000 in developing plans, studies, and making recommendations to you and staff about how the allocations ought to work among the overlying ag owners. That's what we're here about. The base period that we keep hearing about is only relevant when it comes to safe yield or sustainability under Sigma. It has no relevance to how whatever that allowable allocation of water should be divided between overlying owners. It has nothing to do with the 60-40 split. It doesn't have anything to do with the cycles of water and not water. It is based upon how we overline ag owners would like to share that limited resource among ourselves. You should have received a letter from our attorney, Craig Parton, that deals with real water law, not conjectures, not guesses of what may happen in adjudication, not guesses or speculation what may happen in a prescriptive environment. Water law depends upon the current reasonable beneficial use of water today, not how water was used 15 years ago, 20 years. It's how the water is being applied, pumped, used today. That is why the OPV has recommended a much shorter, more current base year, which is entirely consistent with California law and water law. I don't quite understand in staff's presentation why there is not even lip service given to our white paper and our internal allocation plan that we've worked on for 3 years, and we don't even get lip service. I don't quite understand that in all sincerity. I would welcome you and hope that you've read the letters from John and from Craig Parton. I think they are pointed and are completely supportive of the OPV plan, and I'm just here to tell you that I support that plan. I've been worked on it myself. We meet weekly. Jurgen and Marty and I have had the arguments of prescription, self-help, base periods for 3 years, and that's ongoing. Just suffice to say, one lawyer can disagree with another lawyer. I understand that. We'll let an adjudication perhaps ultimately prevail, but we hope that that is avoided by the adoption of the OPV plan. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman West and members of the board. I am John Grether, Grether Farming Company. I'd like to suggest another factor that hasn't been considered. Mr. Loeb presented a comment in one of his early slides that as you go back further in time to establish the base period, the records are more challenging, and that makes perfect sense to me. Another factor, though, that hasn't been mentioned is that my recollection is that it was in 2006 that the GMA required meters, and it was actually a phase-in over 3 years. And then in 2008, there was another resolution by this board to refine and put greater definition on the measurement and the accuracy of those meters. And so to me, it would seem that it would be appropriate to use a time period that matched up to the time period and when all the meters were in place and were all functioning and going through that 3-year testing process. I would also like to say that as a low water user, I support and respect the staff's work and Mr. Gramkow's comments about having a minimum number, because that's very important to us who converted to drip irrigation 15, 20 years ago and have had low water usage throughout this period, well below the sustainable yield of the basin. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
I'm John Lindquist from United Water Conservation District. I'm also United's alternate member on your tag, which I probably haven't mentioned before. I apologize for that delay. I just wanted to respond to Director Borchard's comment or question about past estimates of specific yield made by United as part of our GSP Light effort about 1.5 years ago. And we gave a range of potential sustainable yields that we thought might be possible. We did, as Kim pointed out, we didn't have some of the same information yet today. But that range was included reductions as great as or more than 40% under some worst case scenarios, depending on decisions made about how pumping might be reduced on the plain. And if you shifted pumping, then it was less. It was more like 30%. But right now, I understand the allocation schemes and the specific yield estimates aren't considering shifting of pumping around the plain. That would be considered a project. So the specific yield the possibility of a sustainable yield, involving reductions of up to 40% are reasonable and consistent with what we've said before.
Another question. Thank you for saying that. Maybe it was just me wanting to believe the lower number.
We want to also.
Regarding the recent court case, are you prepared to give an indication of what you think diversions might be going forward? Or is it too soon to have you?
It's too soon. As my assistant general manager mentioned, we just had the court case for a couple of days, or we've just got the decision a couple of days ago. So no, it's entirely likely that in the short run it would affect us. In the long run, we're hoping our habitat conservation plan will move forward as we plan, and ultimately we would be producing or diverting the amount of water that we have historically.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments? Kim, I have a question for you, if you don't mind. With respect to the total water accounting method versus the all water, I understand that one of the differences is that the all water includes interruptible sources, the sources that Jared mentioned with the Canal Creek water or recycled water are interruptible. There's no certainty to those deliveries as well. Is that why they're not included in the total water? And what's your understanding of the difference between those and why one recommended versus another?
So the reason why we don't have those in the total water allocation as an additional allocation is those are in lieu transfers. One entity is transferring their ability to pump to another with some additional water. It's not providing a net savings to the basin. It's just allowing another entity to pump water they wouldn't have allowed to otherwise.
So now, with respect to, if there are no other questions from the board, let's.
Yeah, I didn't really follow that. So my recycled water that I'm selling to farmers, I don't understand why you said I'm selling my ability, my in lieu ability there.
So the programs that that this agency has approved, the Canal Creek
is one.
Exchange Project, as well as the Great Project Exchange, where in lieu credit is received for transferring water from one entity to another to allow them to pump in place of the water that was.
But just how about selling pure recycled water? I don't believe the city of Camarillo got an in lieu credit for that.
No, City of Camarillo did not get an in lieu credit for that.
So that water doesn't count.
Well, that water does work for an individual or an entity that purchases that water, but it does not increase and it allows them to have more water for their operation, but it's not increasing the available water on a basin-wide basis.
I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Does staff still think that your 10-year recommendation is the one that you still recommend in terms of base yield, base year, the base period, even though you know that the data is it's harder to get accurate data going back there, particularly harder to get accurate data for surface water and stuff?
Staff does not have strong feelings on the base period. We felt that we originally had recommended the 16-year-long extended T period for a number of reasons we talked about. There are some problems with it. We showed it just for example because that's where we started. Your board most recently has been talking about the 5-year pre-sigma. We thought the 10-year was a kind of a good compromise. It covered base, but frankly, and that's what we would recommend, but we don't, that's not a strong recommendation. I think there are arguments around the various periods.
Okay, thank you. And Marty, could I ask you a question, please? I didn't get to ask you while you were up. About your idea of fallowing land.
Sure.
Instead of paying the penalty. And of course, the concept would be if you fallow the land, you're going to save water in the next year.
Right.
But would that be with some requirement also that the water be saved? In other words, I could see somebody fallowing X amount of land, but planting a different crop that's a higher water using crop and not actually saving water.
Well, I have an annual allocation, right? And because I don't have enough water in my annual allocation, that would be the way I'd get it the next year, right? I would underpump the following year by that amount, essentially. So that you can call it. I asked for a borrowing. This is just another way for you to picture it. Sure. So the water that goes with that land, we would say you'd have to come up with a number. 2.5 acre feet is the average in the county, or whatever that is. Say that'll tell you how many acres. That 2.5 acre feet comes off your allocation.
So you'd be comfortable somehow with it coming off your next year's allocation.
I get it. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
Before let's move, I guess, to the total water accounting method. Staff wants direction. Notwithstanding the numbers that get applied for total groundwater and surface water pumping, I think the allocation method or the accounting method you've identified is appropriate, and you should, I guess, proceed with the development of that. That's my look at it. It's most consistent with everything that we've heard in terms of accounting for the use of whether it's PTP water or other surface water, Santa Clara diversion water in the allocation system, which avoids the negative impact on surface water users of not including those sources of water. So I think that's a good approach and overcome some of the hurdles we were running into earlier in the process. Anybody have any different thoughts or disagree?
So I think you're saying you support staff's recommendation.
Yeah, except for the numbers. I think the numbers with respect to particularly with respect to the groundwater need some massaging, and that's something we can take up at a different date based on where we wind up on base periods.
You mean you question whether we should be starting with 60,000 acre feet? Or?
Yes.
Okay. All right. You think that number should be different?
Yes.
Higher, lower?
A little higher.
Even though that
would be determined at a later date.
Right. I do, because when I look at the different base periods, it looks to me as if the total water in virtually all of the base periods kisses that 70,000 acre feet level. And we're talking about starting, if we use these numbers, we're talking about starting at basically 66,000. And while that might be consistent with last year's pumping, it's not consistent with any of the base periods on 4B, not a one.
Well,
and I think we need to, when we consider the bumps in the road that we're going to hit with respect to implementing a new system, the number of variance requests we're likely to get when we implement a new system, and I think the leaner we tailor the allocation, the total water amount, the leaner we make that, the more variance requests we're going to see, which is going to complicate everybody's life. Plus, the leaner we make it, the less flexibility we're really building into the system. If we cinch that belt so tight, there won't be any flexibility. There won't be any ability to carry forward. And so, increasing that level a few thousand acre feet, which is what I had in mind, would provide the system with a little more flexibility, would give people a chance, even if it's a little fat today, it changes the slope a little bit, but we get to the same place, and I think it makes the system easier to develop. But that's some of the things going into some of the numbers. We've talked about different numbers and how to get there, but since everything that I was looking at in terms of the various base periods was right up on that 70,000 acre feet line, I thought maybe that's where we should start. But
But you're not arguing for a number right now, even though you're talking all about a number. You're saying we're going to determine it at a later date. If you just leave it at that, I'm
we
okay
don't
with
need a number, but yes, no, in terms of agreeing with staff's recommendation, systemically, yes.
Great, okay. Well, I think staff's recommendation is as good as anything else that I've seen in terms of surface water. I would, just to get it out there, offer that, we've been putting off here, the idea that we would start with a higher allocation for pumping than we've actually are pumping this year seems, for me, pretty counterintuitive to beginning the process. I think that for a lot of people, they're saying if you just start us where we are and we start ramping down, then that starts to phase that in. But if you actually bump us up before you start ramming us down, I just offer that philosophically so that that's out there. But I appreciate that there's just, you can make the case that it might give us more oil in the system to make it work, and I'm open to listening to that. But it's conceptually not certainly. I think that we're being fair by starting at the current. But
I think we're talking about something that we're not talking about today.
Sure, I know, exactly. But well, we could be talking about it. In other words,
it's not on a decision point.
Well, it could be a decision point.
I think we can talk numbers today. I just wouldn't want, some sort of formal motion or ordinance approving a certain number today.
Well, it is in their recommendation.
No, it isn't on one of the things that we're being asked to do.
Well,
it's in the staff report, but in the recommendation and recommended decisions, it's not there.
Well, total water accounting method. The total water accounting method.
The method doesn't necessarily have the numbers.
Doesn't have to have a number to it, but it could have a number to it. Correct, Council? We could say yes, 60,000 and 6,500, or.
Yeah, I think you can provide any guidance you want, including on numbers. I don't think today we should be passing anything that enshrines a number, but short of that, I think discussing them is fine.
It's certainly conceptually, I think Director West is saying, 6,500 seems like a better surface number than 14,000.
You bet.
Okay, so we are talking numbers here. We're conceptually.
I think we can give staff direction and discuss numbers. We're not
setting the numbers.
Is making a motion and setting a number today. That's right.
That's where I was going.
Okay. So I'm fine with that method.
And the other, where that element is concerned.
We're adopting a method.
And any other direction to staff with respect to that methodology before we go on to the base period discussion?
Just to come back to us whenever you need us to be more clear on the numbers, because you may, as you're developing the ordinance, say, now we need a number, right? Okay. But conceptually, we're in the ballpark. Right?
Just as an additional concept of flexibility, obviously, we're going to get to the same point in time. And no, I'm talking about the method.
Oh, the method.
And if we're talking about numbers, Director West's concept makes a certain amount of sense, I think, for growers in that having a little more leeway in that initial start point just gets people to that point perhaps easier down the road. So just wanted to voice that.
I would concur, especially with AMI. I mean, we might see some differences. Maybe there's been some underreporting, and we might see, have a better understanding of what actually has been pumping out there. So over the next year, we might see a little bit, we'll have better determination of what the actual numbers are. So having a little flexibility on the starting allocation might be a good idea.
But I don't think we can make an assumption and base all of our decisions by saying people didn't report accurately.
No, but we will know.
One of the things we can be sure of, I think, is that when the system gets implemented or immediately before or after, that when the implications to each particular grower become apparent and the individual allocation numbers filter down, that there'll be a robust variance system and numerous requests. And I really do think we need, since the way it's been contemplated is that wherever we start, any variances, are going to be within that ceiling and affect everybody else even more. I think it makes sense, particularly initially, to build in some slack into that system so that you can accommodate some of those variances, and then over time that, no pun intended, I guess, but that water will reach its natural level and we can proceed from there. That's one of the reasons for having that little extra water in that system, so we can accommodate some of those various variance requests.
Well, I don't want to get into a long discussion of this, but this will be the last thing I'll say about this topic, and that is that there are many things that we have to factor in, as we're trying to do this. And so it's not the only factor when I say this, but one of the factors is public confidence in this process. And I think if you want, when we have a drought going on and people are being asked to cut back, et cetera, and think about what the impact would be for people to hear, and what we decided to do was actually set the allocation higher than the amount of groundwater we pumped in the last year for the next year. I think that optic by itself is bad, which is part of why it doesn't feel comfortable or feel, that it'll be a challenge for me to get to that point. So, but enough said. Thank you.
Understood.
Chair, could I also just request that perhaps staff of one of our future meetings, a really brief item, but give us an update on how the AMI installations are going?
I think that's.
Are we going to hit that?
I know that's part of the special meeting, what's planned on the agenda for the special meeting on the 12th, assuming that meeting takes place. Is that correct?
Okay.
All right. Moving on then to the board's discussion with respect to a base period.
Chair, sorry to interrupt, but I was thinking perhaps as a preliminary matter, recommendation number 6 is whether or not to keep the January 1 deadline as the goal for having an ordinance in place, depending on how your board feels. I mean, that might affect some of the discussion of the other points.
Take that one next.
Okay, we can certainly do that. I've discussed at length with staff whether or not they can develop the ordinances and the rest of the data that would be necessary to implement an allocation system by January 1st. And they've assured me that they can. And assuming that's still the case, I don't see any reason not to. There are some practical reasons to do it, particularly relating to the AMI, and the consequences of not doing it, or of not, consequences to the grant money of not having a system in place that allows a certain amount of time before that program expires. January 1st, is the deadline that makes all that possible without suffering the consequences. And if the staff can do it, I don't see why we don't. Anybody have a different thought?
It's the date we've always talked about. That's what I think we should continue with.
And Kim said he'll work right through Christmas. He has no problem. That's sorry. Before we then, okay. So I take it then. Do we? I get it from the sense of the board that it is still the board's intention to implement on January 1st, assuming that the work can be done on the ordinance and on the implementation. All right. Now go into the base period discussion. I guess I'll jump in and start it. I have been edified by all of the comments of all of the council who have addressed the board these many months and written to the board, seems even more frequently. It's fair to say that one group of council have managed to convince me that the other group is wrong, and the other group has convinced me equally that the first group is wrong. Having said that, I think we have narrowed the focus with respect to the most reasonable options for the base period for the allocation system. And based on my own reading of Sigma, my recommendation is that we go with the 5 years pre-Sigma. I think that's 2010 through the end of 2014. I think that is based on the graphs I've seen, I think that's a reasonable representation of wet and dry periods, reasonable representation of times when surface water was available and when it wasn't available, and I think it's consistent with both the elements of Sigma and in the post-Sigma legislation. So I guess that would be my recommendation among the options that have been presented to us. You know, over the 10-year period, the 10-year pre-Sigma, hydrologically, it's probably the longer period. I understand why, from a technical standpoint, the longer hydrologic period makes a good deal of sense. I think there are more. The biggest problem I have with that 10-year period is I think that would cause us to overestimate the influence of surface water. We know that going forward, at least over the next 5 years, we're looking at decreased surface water. The longer we go back in time, the more influence surface water has on that total water. And if we don't need to, I don't think we need to step into that. That's why I think those 5 years pre-Sigma is the most reliable.
Could staff please put up the PowerPoint slide? It's the one that is slide 4 of 8 in our packet. It really doesn't matter. It's 3 of 8 or 4 of 8.
4B?
Yeah, 4B.
Yeah.
Yeah, 4B. 4B. It's just the one that shows the
one of these.
PTV, PV, precipitation, and groundwater. There you go, right there.
After a while, they all look alike. So.
I bet, since, we tentatively supported the 5-year in the past, I've been wrestling with this one. I haven't heard a compelling argument that makes me go, I really know for sure this is what we have to do. But what I feel comfortable with, that I'd just like to ask the board to consider for a few minutes, is adding 2 more years to your thought there, which is if you add 2008 and 2009 to this, you're now adding in, so you would have 2008, which would be pretty much a normal water year, 2009 a normal water year, then 2010 a very high, when I say normal water year, I mean precipitation, right? You'd have high precipitation. You'd come back to normal. Then you have 2013 down low and 2014 somewhere in between, but a little bit below average. I think that you blend in. You don't get all of the negative impact of the increased water, the over-reliance on the wet years, but it feels like a better balance, comes closer to capturing a water cycle. Since there's no magic that it has to be 5 or 10, I think 7 lets us create a compromise. A big part of what we're doing is we're choosing winners and losers here between those people that pumped quite a bit more recently because of the drought, and then those people that pumped more because they didn't have access to surface water back in the early 2000s. This is somewhere a little bit more balance between those two, and that has, I think, some appeal from my standpoint of trying to balance the interest of all of our stakeholders that we're trying to represent. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about considering 7 years starting at 2008 as a base period, but I thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, my concern was, just as I mentioned, just an over-reliance on years of abundant surface water that throws off the apportionment.
I guess I would say it actually balances the apportionment, because otherwise you're throwing the apportionment towards the dry years.
Well, not from 10 to 14, the end of 14. You've got it looks like basically 3 abundant years of surface water and 2 restricted years of surface water. So that seemed to be fairly balanced. I didn't think it was, you're right, if you went all the way to the end, then you got more restrictions. Of backing that up to 2014, that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
My only thoughts about that, just in terms of looking at the graph there, are that it adds additional normal rain years. And if I'm to believe the talk of climate change and just in terms of what we're seeing locally on the farm, if we're going to have drier winters and extreme heat elements and things of that nature, I think as a grower, I want to be planning and thinking about less rain, not more. And so from my perspective, adding additional normal rain years would skew that count perhaps a little bit, in that thinking that there would be more average rain years to come. I don't know what to believe regarding rain. I hear different stories all the time from weather people, and we listen to them all. Even in dry periods, we can get excessively rainy years and then, next to nothing. So I think the only thing that farmers are thinking about right now is to expect the unexpected. Now, from my perspective, the 2010 to 2014 takes in a high rain year and some low rain years. It nicely looks at high surface water versus very little to none. It's a shorter period, but it seems to do a nice job of all that. I think I'd lean towards the 2010 to 2014.
I totally agree. I think it's a good balance of representation of where we are and during these drought times, and I can stick my neck out there and say I'm not a climate change person. I think the climate is always changing, but whether we're going to see more rainfall in the future or less, yes, we are. We're going to see more and we're going to see less, but what the average is going to be probably is going to be the same. The average is probably be close to what it's been the last 50 years, but we'll probably have more. We'll have more extremes. We're going to have some more cold and we're going to have some more heat. I'm pretty sure of that. But I think 10 through 14 period, that 5-year pre-sigma is the proper way to go.
I can go with the 5-year.
We do this then as a motion to adopt the 5-year pre-sigma as the OPV agricultural water use base period.
Did we have a motion on the other?
That's the motion.
On the methodology?
That was just a direction. This is
that was direction.
selection.
Okay. Also move.
Chair West, maybe it could be a motion that kind of reflects the consensus advice of the board to staff in preparing the ordinance.
Okay. Either way is fine with me. So then is there a second to that motion?
I'll second it.
Okay. So we'll go forward with a roll call.
So, are we voting on the other item? I mean, are we voting on, the total water accounting method?
No, because that was only to give direction to staff. This is actually to select a base period.
Yeah, so I wasn't sure what staff was, what county council was saying. Were you saying it was a consensus on all these items that we've?
Director West, you're right. I think selecting the base period now is fine. Just, however, Director West originally phrased it as fine. That was my mistake.
Select that as the base period. And that you understood that when you seconded it. Need a roll call.
I thought I made the
Speak to
motion.
the motion, please, Chair West.
No, we've already heard public comment on all the issues.
I'm sorry, but as a part of procedure, I believe the public has an opportunity to speak to the motion.
You've already spoken to
I
the
don't
agenda
believe
item.
so.
You've already spoken to the agenda item, including the base period.
Understood, but I believe the public has an opportunity to speak to the motion.
You'll
Chair
have an
West,
opportunity to
respectfully.
speak, you'll have an opportunity to speak to the ordinance.
So just as a matter of record, you're denying my opportunity to speak to the motion, Chair West,
I'm denying a further opportunity to speak to this agenda item, yes.
specifically to the motion.
Yes.
Thank you.
Because I don't, like I said, I've been wrestling with this. I threw that out there, but I'm willing to join join the rest of my colleagues here in the interest of trying to keep us together as we move forward on these hard decisions.
Do we have a motion and a second?
Chair West?
Yes.
Director Bennett?
Yes.
Director Mobley?
Yes.
Director Craven?
Yes.
Director Borchard?
Yes.
Next item along here is provide recommendations with respect to the accrual or the flexibility.
Now you jumped over minimum allocation.
With respect to, direction to staff, click to ramp down, you're right. I guess that's something we had to decide, but what's the nature of the direction that the staff requires with respect to
The ramp down.
methodology?
Well, Chair West, if your board has direction on that or guidance and further development, we will accept that. But as we discussed, that's not one that we need to land in order to prepare the ordinance. If your board is, guidance is to set that aside and move forward with the initial allocation with the ramp down to be developed in a following action.
Why don't we do that?
Director West, I would recommend that we simply indicate this seems appropriate unless we hear something better, because it just gives people a straw man, and they it's not vague, it's not out there. We've had two people already speak saying, hey, that seems like it makes common sense. And I'm fine postponing the actual decision on it if we want to do that, but I think it's actually helpful for us to get some things out there so that people can respond to that. Going, unless we hear something better, this is where I would go, to the approach that staff has described here.
Director Bennett, do you refer to the approach, or do you refer to we saw a number of 1 1/4 acre feet?
Well, there's two things. There's 1 1/4. So the approach is setting a threshold and setting, unless we hear something better, staff's recommendation of 1.25. I haven't heard anything better than 1.25.
So let's put it in the first reading of the ordinance, and let's let people make comments about it, and we'll go from there.
Well, it's not the first reading of an ordinance. It's just as things are evolving, people can say, well, right now, this is where, just like we did the 5-year thing a couple of meetings ago.
Okay.
We didn't lock into it, but we said, for right now, yeah, do the work on it based on 5 years. But the other methodology, the other method in here is that if you're below 1.25, you don't get to automatically go to 1.25. You have to prove it up. That's probably as important as the 1.25 to get that out there for people to kind of gnaw on that and see what they think.
Agreed. And the concept of a minimum floor, I think, protects lands from being stranded, as we've talked about before. So that's an important concept.
So that'd be the motion I'd make, is just that it is, that we want the record to reflect that at this point in time, if we don't hear something better, we're leaning towards staff's recommendation. However legal leaning towards is in terms of.
Do we need a motion to that effect, or we just give that direction to staff?
I'm
I think that's the consensus of the board at this point. So now we're at accrual and flexibility here.
Let me just get out. I don't want to go anywhere near where we developing a problem like we have right now. So as far as accrual goes, I mean.
And I think that's part of the reason, in answer to Marty's question, I think that's why there is that sunset provision in there, so that we don't, 10 years from now, have the problem that we've been having for so long.
I agree with it.
But on the same token, I sort of like the idea, if it's practical, I'd ask, giving staff direction, I'd ask them to look at and to develop further the notion of fallowing in a subsequent year to make up for, the additional use in a prior year in lieu of paying penalties. And maybe there's a limit on how many times you can do that in a 5-year period or whatever, but.
Well, you certainly can't go over the next year.
Well, obviously, because the next year you got to pay it, it has to be paid back. But I like that suggestion. I mean, it accomplishes what we want to accomplish in terms of both protecting the resource, preserving the resource, but also providing a certain amount of flexibility, particularly for, a grower who finds himself in that last month of the year threatened with running out of water to protect that crop. So, I like being able to, and personally, the penalties are unimportant if we can protect the resource in another way. So that's just my thought. I'd like to see more about that.
Yeah, so Chair West, just to make clear, I'm sure the board understands, that's a separate issue. It's not part of the flexibility discussion. I think that.
Well, I think it is.
No, I think it is. It should be a part of the flexibility concept.
Flexibility. I mean, there's multiple ways of developing a flexibility program. Flexibility may indeed mean accrual, but it may also mean.
Well, it's borrowing.
It's
a form of borrowing.
It is a form of borrowing, but that's a flexibility method as well. It doesn't have it has the immediate payback benefit and a methodology for immediate payback, as opposed to the promise that I'll borrow it today and I may borrow more next year, but I'll pay you back eventually. It's like lending money to my kids that way. I don't want to do that. But the immediate payback, particularly that basically the grower's got a choice if he winds up in that situation. He makes the decision to either fallow land to make up for the extra water he needs in this water year, or he pays the penalty. It's his choice. So you're right. It is borrowing, but it's an element of flexibility.
I would agree, and Marty hit the nail on the head. You can get to the end of the water year and have some extreme heat days, and that entirely changes your irrigation program for where you thought it was going to be. And as we begin to ramp this thing down, things are going to get tight, and people are going to be planning it right down to the edge, and mistakes will be made, and people will go over. That concept of the immediate payback takes us out of this, the agency becoming an accounting mechanism of trying to track everybody's overusage and who borrowed what, and we don't want to go there. I would agree.
Plus, the other part I like about it, if it could work, is that I'd be way more interested in collecting the water, so to speak, than collecting somebody's money.
Precisely.
And that might be a better way of protecting the resource.
It needs to be some sort of I'm sorry, but it seems to me some sort of I don't want to say enforcement, but some sort of strong encouragement that, if that fallowing doesn't occur, or ultimately if the savings doesn't occur to affect the payback, then, there has to be some sort of consequence for that. Just thinking of the bad actors who might think that they can just put this off.
So staff put out some other ways of flexibility, and then one was added, and we've all seemed to jump on the one that was added. So what are your thoughts on the other ones that are in here?
With respect to what we've called the accrual flexibility system, I think the staff's recommendations are appropriate.
A 50% cap.
In terms of the caps and in terms of limitation on carrying it forward with the sunset provision.
5 years.
That makes sense. Yeah, those make sense. On balance, I appreciate the concern that if you're able to set this aside, you want it to be there infinitely, particularly if you need it more than 5 years out. But we've seen what problems that develops. And I think on balance, the sunset provision helps prevent those future problems while still allowing a good deal of flexibility, particularly since you're not going to lose everything. If somebody was to lose it all, they're not going to lose everything at the end of 5 years. It would just be that first 20%. And again, just contemplating where this could go. If you've got that much surplus and there is a water market, you might have another resource for that.
Okay. Would it be 20% or what you accrued the first year of the 5?
I guess that would work
I think
itself
it would
out.
be the first year in the 5.
Yeah.
If it lasts 5 years. But,
Assuming that we're all equal or whatever, I was just.
but we all can't go on collecting because, as we all saw, everybody wanted to use their credits and there was no water to use.
Well, of course,
during the drought.
if everybody's got that much excess,
They're too high, the
every
numbers
year
are
the
too high.
allocations are too high. And that, I think that'll solve itself in time.
This is, of the 5 issues that we have here in front of us, 2 of them being, credits is the one that I feel most strongly about and feel like it's the most important that we get right. We made a huge mistake, and I think if you sat in this room when the board adopted credits, the credit policy decades ago, you wouldn't have found anybody predicting that it was going to cause the problems that it caused. That it was going to. So it is really easy, because you're talking about something that's so valuable and there's so much money involved. It's really easy for us to make a mistake here, to let this create a system that's going to get manipulated. And once people have earned credits, it is exceedingly difficult to sort of try to make the adjustment. So I just think it's something we need to think through very carefully. You can always expand a credit system if you need to, but it's very difficult to pull a credit system back in. And so I would encourage us to be cautious as we start with the credit system. And we certainly have to have we have to have a mechanism that extinguishes credits. And maybe there's something more creative. I was talking about, for the drought cycle, maybe you extinguish some percentage of your credits, in the 3rd year or the 4th year, but you don't extinguish all of your credits for 10 years, so that you can actually stretch them for a long drought if you need to, but that you don't. I'm open to those kind of creative things. With the issue of borrowing, I just think it's a really slippery slope that you can go down. The only thing that could make any sense is if truly somebody was at the very end, and they can't get water from anybody else. Remember, we've got a water market system that we're getting set up. People could turn to that water market to be able to get there. But I think you're going to find it, number one, when it comes to everybody will take advantage of all of the borrowing as fast as possible. So if you did do it, and I think that's something, it should be a very small amount of your water. You can borrow only 5% of your allocation or something, because you're truly at the situation that somebody's talking about. They're at the end of the month and they just need a little bit more to save this crop. I mean, the end of the year, to be able to save the crop and then do that if you're going to do that. But I think staff's made a good face stab here. I definitely would like to have people, this be floated out there and have people really respond. But I hope we have some visionaries that really think about how it could be manipulated by somebody, how it, in other words, put that cap on from the negative side of how could this be taken advantage of also, or how could it cause problems? Because obviously we didn't think that through when we did it last time with credit. So those are my thoughts in terms of that. Thank you.
So as far as flexibility, I mean, Jurgen's got a good point about droughts lasting more than 5 years. But if we just kept it at 5 years and then let's say we're year 4 and we're still in a drought, and it wouldn't be that difficult to maybe at that point extend it, X number of years to give people some more flexibility. But the other way is be flexible on the surcharge. We could maybe or we could adjust the surcharge where there isn't, we don't penalize people too much if they need to use a little extra water, depending on the
varying level. What are you saying?
Yeah, say depending on our say drought conditions or the amount of precipitation or the amount of diversion, say Santa Clara diversion, that we could vary the surcharge based on the conditions, but instead of making it a 25%, make it only a 10% surcharge, just to give a little more flexibility under certain conditions. But I don't know how difficult that would be, but just kind of build or think about building more flexibility based on the climatic conditions.
It's hard for me to
Well,
imagine.
if we look at the plan, we're today at the 26th of September, and we kind of okayed a calendar so that the 24th of October, we're going to do the first reading. So if we're going to do much changing and swapping on the conditions of flexibility, I don't know how much chance, other than when it's in the ordinance, people are going to have a chance to comment on it. I'm just trying to look, because we all wanted to implement January 1st. We got to have the first reading on the 24th of October, the second reading on the 28th of November, unless we want to come back in December to have a second reading. And it would have to be December 1st to go into effect January 21st.
We'll let staff worry about that and come back to us if we need to change the schedule, and they can explain it to us. But to Mike's point, I can't imagine that in the fifth year of a drought, anybody who has accrued anything will have anything left. I certainly understand wanting to hold on, believing that you might have a use for it if the drought lasts longer. I can't imagine for a minute that if we're in year 5, anything that's been banked is still going to be available. I think everything among the recommendations has been accomplished except for the portion of receiving and filing the balance of the report.
Move to receive and file.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, let's move on then to item number 5.
Chair, members of the board, for the record again, Kim Loeb, GMA staff. This is your monthly groundwater sustainability plan update. This will be very short, which I'm sure people will appreciate. So at the September 14th special meeting, your board approved the 2 agreements, one with United, one with Cayugas, to conduct the modeling based on the GMA and our consultant Dudek's modeling input with stakeholder and TAG comments considered. And that modeling, those modeling agreements have been executed, and the initial modeling has started. The modeling it's starting with current conditions. It's not considering credits in terms of current conditions. It's considering current water levels in the basins to begin with, which is, I think, what has generally been discussed. The initial simulation results, we plan to take that to TAG on October 5th, and then the initial results will come to your board also on October 24th. So that'll be an eventful board meeting as well. In terms of water quality for the Las Posas Valley, the water quality sustainability indicators, Dudek made a presentation to your board at the August 29th meeting about a proposed approach using water quality objectives from the basin plan. Your board directed that we take that to the TAG for technical feedback on that approach, which we did at the September 6th meeting. TAG members had a number of technical concerns about that approach, and so subsequent to that meeting, Dudek and staff have been working on a revised approach that would really be consistent with your board's past direction and also consistent with Sigma's stated baseline of January 1st, 2015 for unreasonable results. And basically the approach would be to look at those 2015 water quality concentrations and limit further degradation from the 2015 conditions. Those would be where the minimum thresholds would be set. We're going to return to the TAG on the October 4th meeting to discuss the revised approach in more detail and then get those comments from TAG, and then bring those back to your board at the October 24th meeting. That's the end of my update on the GSP development.
I know the department recently did a survey and a seminar with respect to water quality regulations for GSPs. Anything new or interesting come out of that?
Well, they haven't completed their survey, and they did come out with that. We do know that Department of Water Resources, DWR, has been having the most challenge with how to integrate water quality into the Sigma framework. That's been the biggest challenge, and that's why they have not finished their best management practice for that. The survey came out, I think, to collect that information. It'll be interesting to see what they come up with. I know that Glenn and Jeff are planning to go to Sacramento and meet with DWR on this. I don't know the date of that.
Chair, your executive officer and I are planning to go up on the 4th, the same day as the TAG meeting, and meet with Trevor Joseph at DWR to discuss this effort.
Well, thank you.
So we'll have the results of what they learn up in Sacramento from DWR, what the current thinking is, that we can then blend into our presentation recommendations to your board on the 24th of October.
Thank you. Kim, any other questions from the board? Any questions from the public on this item?
Chair West and directors, my name's Jane Donlin Waters. I am the the queen of the chairman of LPUG. And I just wanted to comment, LPUG had a meeting on September 12th, and we did talk about the shift in approach for the water quality standards in the GSP for the Las Posas. And as we heard from Kim, numbers are going to be changing from what we had heard at the last meeting. But I think that the process concerns that were voiced at LPUG are still meaningful. And that's that there's a feeling that the interest of beneficial uses and users of groundwater have really not been considered in selecting numbers, and also that we were a little confused. The presentation at the August board meeting indicated that the shift in approach was related to comments from stakeholders, and nobody sitting around our table had made any comments requesting that numbers be put in for water quality for the Las Posas. And in going back and reviewing the comment letters that are posted on the GMA website, as well as tables that had been prepared for you by the consultants, we couldn't find any comments that were made that were requesting this type of change in approach. So we're a little confused about that and concerned about, we were under the impression that comments were to be given in writing during the public comment period, and we couldn't find comments that would justify the shift. So I believe that LPUG will be submitting a letter with some more detail about the discussion in the future, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Anyone else? Kim, actually, Jean's comment reminded me of something that I thought I had after our last discussion with respect to the regional board numbers as the standard for Las Posas. It occurred to me that we might be overcomplicating the analysis for purposes of Sigma. The degradation of water quality is only an issue if it is significant and unreasonable. And no doubt, an argument can be made that because the TDS levels and other levels don't meet regional board standards, that they are significant. But because that water is being used, whether it's blended or treated or otherwise being used, maybe it's not unreasonable. So we may have a situation where the degradation of water quality is significant, but reasonable, given the fact that people are still able to make beneficial use of it. And maybe that's as far as the analysis for the purposes of Sigma has to go. Just a thought. I'll leave that with you so that when you can discuss that amongst yourselves or with TAG, but, I'm just not so sure that we need to go down the road of setting, new quality standards for purposes of Sigma. Whether it's a good idea or not is a different question, but whether it's necessary is the question that I'd like to address when it comes back.
Well, wouldn't we want to at least set limits of what, or determine what is undesirable?
Right, at what point is it no longer usable?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that would be for municipal use and for agricultural use, because it's certainly.
Because you're right, at that point, when you couldn't use it anymore, it would seem to me that would be the definition of an unreasonable level.
But there's also levels of, let's say chlorides at 100 is still usable for, let's say, avocados, but if you go to 120, then it's no longer usable. But you set it at 100 and help.
Maybe there are other crops that can't do it at 100.
But I agree, because I think that's the approach that we should look at, as opposed to looking at the regional board standards or anybody else's. At what level are the people using this water unable to use it? At what point is it no longer, of beneficial use? Because that would certainly make it unreasonable. We already know it's significant. If we get to significant and unreasonable, obviously there's got to be a management action to address that. I don't know if we're there, but it would be nice to know what those values are.
Yep.
And to be more precise, Mike, those chloride levels have exceeded your number already. People are blending. That's how they're dealing with it. And this was my comment, and the reason for my concern last month was yes, they're significant and they're important to the agricultural users out there, but if we decide that we're going to limit them at some point, pick the 2015 conditions, okay, we may have already exceeded those conditions. What do we do to limit further degradation? Do we stop pumping? If we do, does it fix the degradation? We've been told no. And okay, so do we install a big project to fix the degradation? What is the cost of that project, and who pays for it? And do the users even want it? When actually, many of them are considering RO facilities of their own. The Cayugas Brine Line is running right down the LA Avenue. There's a way to mitigate the problem. If we set limits and levels in our GSP, we're going to be held to task for that. That's my concern. And if we're held to task for it, we still won't fix it.
And the biggest thing is blending is always the easiest way out, but what is the cost of that blended water? And at what level does it make it, uneconomical to farm? And
you're right.
Continue.
Many of those folks think it's wet water.
And I'm sorry, I've got a 4 o'clock and I'm running late for my.
I do too.
Anything further?
While you're philosophizing here.
We need a motion to receive and file. A second?
Second.
All in favor? All right, so then need a motion to receive and file the executive officer's report.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. We're adjourned. Thank you, gentlemen.